Hey guys, thanks for coming out to our first Brackets hackathon or our Brackathon. So I'm going to provide just a really quick overview for those who aren't familiar with brackets, although I think a lot of you guys are. That's why you're probably here. So just a quick introduction. So what is Brackets? So Brackets is an open source code editor built for the web. It's actually out there on GitHub if you want to start downloading the code right now. It started as a little bit of an experiment to see could we build this with this sort of web platform technologies? Could we start to build tooling around it? And if we did, could we start to sort of push forward what these tools could actually do for web developers? So the first important thing to note about Brackets is that it's actually built with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, right? So it's built for web standard developers. It's made for web standard developers. So that's pretty interesting, right? So if you have the skills to work on Brackets or to use Brackets, you also have the skills to hack on Brackets, to extend it, to customize it. To make that possible, we also made sure that it was an open source project and MIT licensed. So that means like very little restrictions on what you can do with the code. In fact, there's probably no restrictions at all. Go and focus on GitHub, never talk to us again. That's totally cool, and we want you to do that. But again, it's this interesting idea that, if you're a web developer, you know HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. We're now in this position where the tool that you're using every day can be completely optimized to what you need. So whether you're just talking about customizing it specifically for your workflow, never giving that back, or it's just, man, I ran into a bug. What am I going to do? You can actually just go and fix it. And you really do have all those skills that you need to do that. So we also wanted to take a different approach to how we build brackets too. We could have built this in private and done this, up until this big 1.0, and it would have been sort of an Adobe project that maybe we open source later. But we really wanted to engage the community and engage everybody very early on in the process. So we open sourced it as soon as we possibly could. Once Adobe Legal said everything was okay. And so we open sourced it. It's available on GitHub today. There's actually two projects. There's Brackets and then there's Brackets app. So Brackets is really the core of the project there. That's where all the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS lives. What Brackets app is really this thin native wrapper that brings it to the desktop. And I'll talk about some of the targets for Brackets there. So there's these two projects. Brackets app basically pulls into Brackets. So if you're trying to download everything, you go to Brackets app, but the real core code is in Brackets itself. As I mentioned before, we're MIT licensed. We really didn't want to put any sort of restrictions on this, on what you could do, on where Brackets could actually go. So whether you're hacking on the branch that we've got going on, or you want to take it in a completely different direction or maybe a different target, you're completely free to do that. You're free to embed it into other products. You can basically do whatever you like. We're also trying to do a lot of our public planning and feature development on our public backlog on Trello. So if you guys are familiar with Trello, it's a new backlog service out there. Basically, all the features we're planning to work on in Brackets over the next couple years is all going to be pushed into Trello. You can see it prioritized. You can see what we're working on next. So if you want to go and grab a feature or you want to go and fix a bug, you can actually see where we're going, so you don't actually have to step on our toes. You can say, oh, I really like that feature, but it's pretty far down on the backlog. I'm going to start working on it now rather than wait for the core team to start working on it. All of our planning is happening on mailing lists and IRC, and I'll show you the links for all that sort of stuff. But the really important part here is that it's really community driven. We have our ideas of what we want to do with Brackets. I'm going to show you some of the innovations that we kind of started out with. And that was really just to kind of seed, what's possible here. The rest of it is going to be up to where the community takes us. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the success we've had early on with the open source project. So to talk about Brackets, though, I actually want to talk about what it's not. Right? So Brackets is not an IDE. We're not trying to build this big, giant, kitchen sink and everything sort of development environment. We're really just focusing on a code editor. And I use the word code editor because it's not a text editor, right? There's a lot of popular text editors that are out there, and they do a okay job, but they don't play favorites, right? They're not specifically meant just for writing code, especially for the web. We want to optimize that specifically for web development. So in Brackets, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, they're the stars of the show, and other related web technologies. And because we're making that special exception and saying these things are a lot more important, you're going to be able to see we can build features that you probably wouldn't see in other editors that have to sort of play generic across all sorts of code. So we have two sort of interesting ideas that we've thrown into Brackets. One of the first philosophies that we have is that tools really should not get in your way, right? You shouldn't have to sort of stumble over a tool to get your work done. It should really get out of your way at all possibilities. One of the things we've done is this idea around quick edit, which is this idea that we can sort of edit code in line with other code without having to jump around files and do that sort of dance that we're all sort of been used to doing for a while. And the other part is that Brackets is really in love with your browser. There is no design view in brackets. The design view is the browser, but we can do more than just do that sort of save, reload that we've probably gotten used to over the last decade. We actually make a live connection to the browser, your local browser, and we actually talk to it. We give it updates on the design. We can actually do live debugging with inside of that browser. And the idea is that you're not in some faux browser. You're actually in the same browser that you've installed locally, but everything is actually running there, but you have a nice relationship between the editor and the browser. So with that, I think I've done enough slides. Let me actually kind of show you what Brackets looks like. So Brackets is pretty lightweight and pretty small. I think the install is still under 50 megs, depending on your Windows or on Mac. Loads pretty fast. We want to make sure that it's not, overburdened. It's not going to take up a lot of memory. It's nice and portable. I'm going to go ahead and turn a couple things off, right? So because Brackets is written in HTML and JavaScript, we use Brackets to develop Brackets. It's some weird Inception-y thing going on. And so there's a lot of things in Brackets you'll find that aren't really official features, but we're using them as part of our development, such as JSLint support that's in here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because I get really discouraged every time I see JSLint. So I've got a simple HTML document here. As you can see, the UI, we try to keep it as clean as possible. I've got files, I've got code. I can even make the files go away with a simple keyboard shortcut, and it's just back to me in the code. We didn't want to have a whole bunch of floating panels and toolbars and icons because that stuff is really distracting when all I want to do is sort of write some code. So your typical code editor that you might expect, I can basically switch around folders, do all sorts of cool stuff. But some of the more interesting stuff is around that idea around tools not getting in your way. So today, if I want to go ahead and edit this HTML, there's some CSS attached to it. There's a JavaScript file attached. And if I wanted to say, all right, I want to change the section tag a bit, I would basically have to open up my CSS file. And you guys have probably all done this and been like, all right, so where is the properties that apply here? And I go through this ridiculously long list. And if I wrote this, I probably have a good idea, if I've organized it fairly well, which one I'm after. But if you're coming into somebody else's project, you're working on a team, it's going to be kind of hard to do. So rather than sort of do this sort of dance where we're sort of dancing or moving around with files, we wanted to see if we could sort of bring some of this stuff in line. And this is also that part where we can focus on just what HTML and JavaScript does. So we know about this relationship. We know that CSS and HTML are tied together. So what if I hit Control E, and we basically rip open an editor inline into brackets? And what we're basically doing here is saying, all right, you basically want to know about this ID on Impress. Let's go and find all the CSS that applies to that. Now, right now, there's only one rule. So we rip it open. We find that it's basically in the Impress CSS file, shows you the line numbers and everything. And I can actually go ahead and edit this in line. To do a little bit more, I can actually go down. We can have multiple of these editors open. Like if I wanted to go ahead and play around with this H1 tag here, we hit Control E again. Now here, there's a lot of different rules that apply. Now the first one's the big reset, so it's actually catching everything. And our algorithm's not so great right now. We're basically just looking for everything. We're going to improve that as we go. But I can actually use the keyboard, scroll down through a couple of these, and I'll find the one that I'm looking for. And I can say, all right, this one's probably the most precise, right? It's within a title class. It's got my H1. But now I can actually start to edit this. Now, I mentioned before that Brackets wants to have sort of a live connection to your browser. So we've got this sort of sideways lightning bolt here. Go ahead and click this guy. So I get a little bit of a refresh because I'm actually had a local file open. Still holds my position and where I was. But basically now we're having this basically conversation with the browser. So if I start to go ahead and edit this stuff, like say I want to go make this title a bit bigger, you'll see everything starts being edited in real time. So a lot of the stuff that you're probably used to doing in developer tools, except what would happen is you'd be in your developer tools, you make a whole bunch of tweaks, and then you'd be like, crap, how do I get this back into my code? I've made so many tweaks I completely forgot. And we wanted to bring some of that stuff right back into your editor because it's kind of probably where it belongs. So I can actually go ahead and tweak this guy. Let's see, what's this guy? Maybe to like 325, so a bit better. But the idea is that we've got a lot of control over here. I can add new classes. They're going to be applied automatically. It's not like it has to be already predefined. It's basically anything that you go in here is going to get updated. And so if I go ahead and just even add stuff like, see if I can turn this hot pink, we're going to see the live feedback. So from a design point of view, it's really, really nice when you're designing in the browser to be able to actually see all the changes happening, not have to do save, jump over to the window, hit reload, that sort of thing. So yeah, put that guy back. And so this is one of those things, like, right, because we care a little bit more about HTML, JavaScript, CSS, we know about those relationships between them. We know how all these sort of things tie together, and so we can start to build better tooling around how that sort of stuff goes. So that's not the only thing we can do. So we've started experimenting, and we started with CSS, just basically to put that inline editor in, get that UI down, get that sort of structure, and we'll talk about how you can actually extend that. But we can do more than that. So in this past sprint, we actually started working on a way to do it basically with JavaScript as well. So if I'm in a JavaScript function, a lot of the times I'm sitting here being like, all right, I forget what the parameters that are being passed in here. I can actually go ahead and do that again here, and what we'll basically do is do the same sort of thing we did with CSS, except now I'm looking, all right, where's the function arrayify? It'll actually pull that in for me. Even though it's in the same file, I could have probably jumped around, did a quick find to find it or whatnot. But basically now I can see that function. So I can either edit that function in line here, so I can start doing that. In the future, we'll be able to inject JavaScript live into the browser as well. So right now we're only dealing with CSS, but we can actually take that a step further. But I can also just use this as a documentation thing. So now I can see what the parameters are. I can see what that function is going to do as I'm coding. I don't have to sort of bounce around through all my code. Now, obviously, I have a pretty simple project here, right? One HTML file, one CSS, one JavaScript file. If you guys are lucky enough to have projects this simple, then this probably isn't that daunting or that impressive. But you can imagine large projects, it starts to become really, really helpful, especially in a productive sense. But inline editors aren't just about code either. We can basically do all sorts of tooling in there. So we've prototyped things like color pickers and gradients and sort of stuff like that. So it's a little bit more visual, things you might have popped out to like Illustrator or Photoshop or Fireworks. But we can also do some things inline as well. And so we did this other one. This is a nice little inline image viewer that if I pop this guy open, we could actually see the image. So you can actually get a little bit of a preview of what's going on. And again, basically because Brackets is a web browser, anything that can be displayed in a web browser gets actually run there, including animated GIFs, which I'm sure everyone's super happy about. So in general, that's Brackets, right? This is where we are today. We've been developing, I think we are now on we just completed our 8th sprint. We work on about 12 working day cycles. So that's roughly about 16 to 20 weeks worth of development. So we're still really, really early on. Definitely not in a place where we'd say, oh man, you should drop your current code editor and jump here. So in fact, we've got a lot of work to do to get there. But let's talk about a little bit about how we've gotten here. So we open sourced the project on May 15th, just a couple weeks ago. We didn't really market it at all. I mean, it was kind of weird because literally what it was an accomplishment of, getting through red tape and getting through patents and export compliancy and all the sort of stuff that Adobe made us do before we could officially open source it. So we flipped the switch on GitHub, didn't really tell anybody, didn't say anything about it. Immediately, we got about 1,300 followers as of yesterday. We've got 85 forks, so we're getting a lot of traction. In just the 2 weeks, we've gotten 7 new external contributors with more pull requests than I could count as I was going through GitHub. But the key is that, it's an open source project. So this isn't something like we're big and leaning into and, I could be seeing big marketing messages because really what we're here to do is recruit people to help work on this, to help sort of drive the vision of where Brackets can go. So our last sprint, which we just finished up actually yesterday on Friday, we launched the open source project, so that was a big thing for us. We dedicated actually a lot of time to fix bugs. We're really adamant about keeping our bug count really low. In fact, we try not to work on new features if our bugs hit a certain threshold, which can be troubling at times, especially when you add new innovative features like inline editors and things that add crazy bugs you never would have expected. So we spent a lot of time. We closed like 31 issues this last sprint. We also started focusing a lot on performance. So Brackets, as I mentioned before, is kind of a bit of an experiment, right? Can we build desktop tooling and can we build tooling in general on this platform? And one of those things that people will first come out and say is, how performant can it be, especially on native? So we're really focused on this performance aspect, and we spent a lot of time in Sprint 8 doing a lot of instrumentation and measurement of how Brackets can perform. In fact, if you go into Brackets, you'll see under the debug menu, you can actually see performance data about how Brackets is doing. And so a lot of what we're doing now is just adding those instrumentations so then we can get some baselines and then we can start improving. We can start actually trying to make things a bit faster. We also started to begin our extensibility story. So as you can imagine, a lot of the things you might want to build into Brackets might not make sense into the core of Brackets, right? You could use Brackets to edit PHP, but because we're focused on front-end web technologies, probably is not going to make sense in core. That's where an extension comes in. Or if you want to build an extension for your favorite framework or whatnot. And so we started working on that, and how we did it is basically we're building prototypes of extensions. And as we're building prototypes, we said, all right, well, let's do this JavaScript inline editor. What do we need to build that? And as we're starting to build those prototypes, we're starting to fill out that API. So as you'll see in the next couple sprints, what we're basically focused on is building more and more of these sort of prototypes and getting more and more complex. And so we hopefully within the next month and a half, we'll actually have a pretty robust API of just things that have come out of, okay, we needed this to build it. The other really great thing that came out of Sprint 8.2 is we had a guy, Jonathan Rowney, actually build the first extension. So we didn't even have an extension API. He just started it, got in there, started hacking. and wrote a snippets extension where you can basically type in a couple lines of code, hit a magic key, and it drops snippets in for you. And all the snippets are stored in JSON. And that's actually public on GitHub as well. And we've got it listed on our wiki. But really cool stuff, again, with very little involvement because it's just HTML and JavaScript. Anybody can sort of jump in and start playing. So after the hackathon, we're going to start our next sprint. We're actually focused a little bit now on our app shell. So right now, we kind of put this really thin native layer around it to bring it to the desktop. But we want to solidify what we're doing there. And that's actually kind of holding us back on sort of Linux support and native menus and stuff like that. So we've got a research spike. We're going to be looking at the app shell. We're also looking at ways to actually embed Node.js directly into the desktop app, because that can bring a whole bunch of really actually cool features that we could add into, as well as helping us work with some things like File I/O. We're also going to be working on an API for extensible menus and key bindings. So right now, a lot of that stuff is hard-coded. If you want to add a new menu, it's kind of hard to do if it's even possible without editing the core, as well as sort of adding new keyboard shortcuts. We'll be prototyping some new extensions. We're also constantly giving back to the CodeMirror code base. So the core editor that's in brackets is actually based on another open source project called CodeMirror. And so a lot of the things that we're doing, whether it's scrolling performance, which is the one that we're working on now, or even that inline editor, is actually being pushed all back into CodeMirror as well. So it's not just sort of in our own little private world. And that JavaScript quick edit that I show you, we're actually going to turn that into a formal feature this sprint, clean it up, get it to work in all sorts of different scenarios. So where Brackets is today is on the desktop. You can imagine, we're building it on web platform technologies, so there's really no limit to where Brackets can go. You could imagine this could be completely running in the browser. It could be sort of a cloud-based service. And while we believe that that's where the future is heading, when we started to talk to a bunch of developers, we found that they still wanted traditional tools. And so we wanted to start on the desktop and hopefully lead people to the cloud by supplementing with a Brackets version in the cloud or a Brackets version that runs in the browser. So a lot of our focus from the core team right now is going to be based on the desktop. But beyond that, we actually want to take it into a bunch of different places. So once we get the desktop nailed down, we get a lot of our 1.0 core features that are going to be in there. We're going to continue feature development. That'll always be ongoing. We're going to keep listening to the open source project. But we also want to extend where Brackets can go. Just a few of the ideas that we have, right? There's the cloud-hosted idea, the sort of I go to brackets.io, and there's a editor right there, and the files are stored in the cloud for me. Another interesting aspect is around embedding Brackets into another web application. So you can imagine if WordPress wanted to have a really kick-ass HTML editor rather than a text area, you could just drop Brackets in. And so all this stuff should be possible, and we actually want to take it to those different places. Another interesting area is, wrapping Brackets up in PhoneGap, bringing it out to your tablet. So your iPad is now your development device. Now, definitely not one of those things where you're going to pop up the keyboard. You're probably going to want to bring a Bluetooth keyboard if you're going to be doing some serious development there. But the idea is that it can run there. It can actually run pretty quickly too. So we can actually start to play around with where it can go. And finally, there's other ideas of, can Brackets run just as a browser extension? Could it run as a local server? Maybe I go and I download Zen PHP, and Brackets is installed as part of it. So right out of the box, I can start developing, and there's no other tool set and chain. There's lots of different ways places that we can take Brackets. And to be honest with you, this is where we want to go, and I don't even really know what the priority here is, but the fact is you don't even have to wait for us. If someone wants to take what we've got and start heading in these different directions in parallel, we can definitely do that. So to wrap up, what this is really all about is we need some help. We want people to get involved. So the project is hosted on GitHub. As I mentioned, there are the two ones, but Brackets is the main one. We've got our wiki, which is just really starting to evolve. In the last couple of weeks, the pages are just starting to fill up. Our public backlog's on Trello, so if you see there's a feature is not there, you want to see if it's in our backlog, or maybe you have a great idea that we've completely missed, you can basically see what we're doing there. You can see how our progress is happening on that sprint. We've got a Google group set up for our mailing list, where a lot of it's geared towards the contributors as well as extension builders right now, not sort of general consumer help, but of course we're there to help as well. And we also hang out in the Brackets channel on Freenode. So the entire team, basically, we switched over from using our internal IM networks for team chat to moving over to IRC. So it's a mix between the team and new extension builders that are coming out there. And of course, can't be a project in 2012 without having a Twitter handle. So we've got Brackets, thanks to Divya. And so with that, I got some time for Q&A if anybody's got some questions.
So you said you're using CodeMirror, and I know right now you can embed CodeMirror, and a lot of people do embed CodeMirror. So I'm wondering, what would be the difference between embedding CodeMirror and embedding brackets? Like when would you embed one versus the other?
Well, so CodeMirror is just the core editor. Oh, so the question is like, what's the difference between embedding CodeMirror and embedding brackets, right? If CodeMirror is just basically the core editor, everything that we add on, all the sugar, is basically becomes brackets. It's the file management and how we deal with it, and the APIs that may go and talk to Dropbox or may talk to Google Drive. It's the inline editor and the understanding the relationship between JavaScript. It's the actual connection to the browser and stuff like that. So there's more than just the sort of static editing of code. There's the other things that brackets are add on. And if you at the early stage, it's a little light in brackets, but obviously if you look at the backlog of what we're planning to do, things start to sort of pile up beyond that. So cool. All right. Well, thank you guys. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the hackathon.